The Savoy Hotel, London. Billionaire CEO Victoria Pemberton had a devastating problem. Her companion for the year's most exclusive gala had abandoned her at the last second. In a moment of rage and arrogance, she decided to humiliate everyone by bringing him as her escort. James Mitchell, the silent janitor who had cleaned her offices for 3 years. She thought he was just an illiterate nobody to use as a puppet. She didn't imagine that this man with calloused hands spoke 5 languages, had a past as a military intelligence colonel, and had been planning for 3 years his revenge for his dead wife. When the Russian ambassador recognized him at the gala, calling him Colonel Mitchell, the house of cards began to collapse. And Victoria understood too late that she had invited her executioner to her last party as a free woman. The fluorescent lights of the 30th floor of Pemberton Tower reflected off the black marble floor like stars fallen from the London sky. James Mitchell pushed his mop with hypnotic movements, the same ones for 3 years, erasing the footprints of shoes that cost more than he earned in 6 months. The rhythm of his work was a meditation, a mask of normalcy hiding much darker thoughts. It was 8 o'clock on a November Friday that London would never forget. The rain beat against the floor-to-ceiling windows with unusual violence, transforming the lights of Canary Wharf into impressionist watercolor stains. The building was almost empty. Only the lights from Victoria Pemberton's office still shone on the top floor, like a beacon of ambition that never went out. James knew every inch of that office. 3 years studying every movement of that woman, every habit, every weakness. 3 years pretending to be invisible while memorizing passwords whispered on the phone, documents carelessly left on the desk, private conversations that Victoria conducted believing the janitor didn't understand English, French, Russian, Mandarin, Arabic. He could hear her screaming through the bulletproof glass walls. Victoria Pemberton's voice, when angry, could cut diamond. That evening, her fury had a precise reason. Charles Worthington, the industrialist who was supposed to accompany her to the Red Cross Gala, had just called to cancel. His wife had discovered the affair, was threatening divorce. Game over. The gala was in 3 hours, the event of the year where London's power displayed itself, where alliances were formed and destroyed between a glass of champagne and a false smile. Showing up alone for Victoria would be like bleeding in a sea of sharks. Her rivals would see her as weak, vulnerable, attackable. James continued cleaning, but every fiber of his body was tense like a violin string. He knew something would happen that night. He felt it in the air like animals feel earthquakes. 3 years of waiting were about to bear fruit. The office door burst open with such force that the glass trembled. Victoria Pemberton emerged like a fury in a black Alexander McQueen suit, a masterpiece of tailoring worth £20,000 that wrapped a body kept perfect by personal trainers, surgeons, and a diet that would make a Tibetan monk cry. 39 years that looked 30, platinum blonde hair pulled into a chignon so tight it seemed like a natural facelift, eyes gray as weapon steel. She stopped in the middle of the corridor, phone in one hand, in the other, a glass of Japanese whiskey that probably cost more than James's weekly salary. She looked at him. No, she didn't look at him. She evaluated him like one evaluates an object, a piece of furniture, a tool to use and discard. James continued pretending not to see her, focused on the already perfectly clean floor. It was a game they had played for 3 years. She pretended he didn't exist. He pretended not to really exist. But that night, the game was about to end. Victoria studied him with laser intensity. 6 feet 2 of muscles hidden under deliberately loose work clothes, shoulders that betrayed years of military training disguised as a laborer's posture, hands that gripped the mop, but that she, if she had looked closer, would have noticed had calluses in the wrong places for a janitor. Weapon calluses, not broom calluses. The idea struck her mind like an evil lightning bolt. It was perfect in its cruelty, genius in its arrogance. She would bring the janitor to the gala. The message would be clear. Victoria Pemberton was so superior, so untouchable, that she could afford to show up with anyone and still dominate the scene. Her rivals would be forced to interact with a janitor as an equal, humiliating themselves in the process. She approached James with steps that echoed like gunshots in the empty corridor. He continued cleaning, but he could smell her perfume. Chanel No. 5 mixed with the metallic smell of ambition. When she spoke, her voice was poisoned honey. The proposal was simple and humiliating. £3,000 for 3 hours of work. Wear a tuxedo. Smile. Nod. Don't speak unless strictly necessary. Disappear at midnight. For a janitor earning £1,400 a month, it was an offer impossible to refuse. James finally raised his eyes. For 3 years he had avoided looking at her directly, always keeping his gaze low, submissive, harmless. But in that moment, for a fraction of a second, Victoria saw something that made her shiver to the core. It wasn't the look of a janitor. It was the look of a predator who had patiently waited for the prey to enter the trap. The moment passed so quickly that Victoria convinced herself she had imagined it. The stress, the whiskey, the anger at Charles. James had already lowered his gaze again, mumbling a humble, "Yes, ma'am," that seemed straight out of a period drama. An hour later, in the presidential suite of the Savoy, the metamorphosis occurred. The team of stylists Victoria had urgently summoned worked on James like sculptors on marble. But when he emerged from the dressing room, everyone understood they hadn't created anything. They had only revealed what had always been there. The Tom Ford tuxedo seemed to have been woven directly onto his body. Every line, every fold, every proportion was perfect. But it wasn't the suit that shocked Victoria. It was the way James wore it, not with the embarrassment of a disguised janitor, but with the naturalness of someone who had worn tuxedos in embassies, state receptions, dinners with generals and ministers. The hair, usually hidden under a greasy cap, was cut with military precision, gray at the temples in a way that added distinction, not age. The beard, which Victoria had always seen unkempt, had been trimmed, revealing a strong, almost aristocratic jaw. But the final blow came when James pulled a watch from his pocket. Not the digital Casio he usually wore, but a Patek Philippe Nautilus in steel. £40,000 of Swiss watchmaking that no janitor could ever afford, not even selling a kidney. He put it on with the same naturalness as putting on a hair tie. Then, from the shoes the stylists had brought, he chose not the most expensive, but the most appropriate, a detail only someone accustomed to these environments would notice. Victoria felt the first crack in her perfect plan. Who was this man, really? But pride was stronger than doubt. She had made her choice. She couldn't go back. The limousine carried them through a London dressed up for the Christmas season. The lights transformed Oxford Street into a river of stars. Westminster Abbey glowed like a giant of stone and light. James sat composed, hands resting on his knees in a position that screamed military training to anyone who knew how to look. During the journey, Victoria tried to probe him with apparently casual questions. Where had he learned to clean so well? How long had he been doing this job? Did he have family? James answered with polite monosyllables, revealing nothing, protecting everything. But when they passed the Russian embassy in Kensington Palace Gardens, Victoria noticed a detail that froze her. James stiffened imperceptibly. His right hand moved a few millimeters toward his left side, the instinctive movement of someone looking for a weapon that's no longer there. It had lasted less than a second, but Victoria had seen it. Buckingham Palace appeared before them like a Baroque jewel illuminated by spotlights that made it look like something out of a fairy tale. The red carpet was a blood-red sea surrounded by photographers, journalists, onlookers held back by barriers and security. The elite of London, Britain, Europe were arriving in a ballet of limousines and supercars. When their car stopped, Victoria took a deep breath. This was the moment. Either she triumphed or was destroyed. She took James's arm with a smile she had perfected in 20 years of hostile board meetings. The janitor, who wasn't a janitor, offered her his arm with the grace of a dancer. They got out of the car under the explosion of flashes. Photographers shouted Victoria's name, asking who her companion was. She smiled, enigmatic, letting the mystery fuel curiosity. They entered the palace through the monumental doorway. The interior had been transformed into a paradise of crystal and gold. Murano chandeliers hung from the frescoed ceiling. Rare orchids decorated every corner. A string quartet played Mozart with surgical perfection. London's elite turned to look at them. Victoria savored the moment of triumph. She had caught them all off guard. No one expected her to show up with a stranger, much less a stranger who looked like he'd stepped out of a James Bond film. But the triumph lasted exactly 47 seconds. The time it took Russian Ambassador Dmitry Volkov to cross the ballroom, ignore everyone, and stop in front of James with eyes wide as if he'd seen a ghost. Ambassador Volkov was a man who had seen the Soviet Union fall, survived 3 assassination attempts, and navigated the deadly waters of Russian politics for 30 years. He wasn't easily surprised. Yet, in front of James, he looked like a child who had seen Santa Claus. He spoke in Russian, rapid and agitated. James responded in the same language with perfect fluency. The conversation lasted less than a minute, but it was enough to change everything. Volkov walked away after shaking James's hand with military respect, whispering something that froze Victoria's blood even though she didn't understand Russian. The domino effect was immediate. Other guests who had heard the exchange began to approach. General Harrison, former chief of staff, greeted James warmly. The French military attaché shook his hand, calling him Mon Colonel. The German consul made a toast to his health. In less than 10 minutes, the janitor Victoria had brought to humiliate her rivals had become the center of attention. And not condescending attention, but genuine respect, almost reverent awe. During the opening waltz, as they danced under the Turner paintings, Victoria felt the ground crumble under her Louboutin heels. James guided her with a precision that spoke of years of training in embassy ballrooms. Every movement was perfect, every step measured. It was then that he spoke, in a low voice, never losing his smile for the cameras recording them. He told her a story that almost made her stumble. 3 years earlier, Colonel James Mitchell of military intelligence had lost his wife in a car accident. The car had been rammed by a stolen van, never found. His wife, 6 months pregnant, had died on impact. The baby girl, Emma, had survived by miracle. The investigations had been buried. Someone very high up had made evidence disappear. Witnesses, everything. James had understood it wasn't an accident. His wife, an investigative journalist, was about to publish an investigation.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
Into counterfeit drugs sold by Pemberton Pharmaceuticals in Africa. 2,000 children dead in Kenya from diluted vaccines and fake antibiotics. Victoria continued dancing, but her body was rigid as marble. She remembered that operation. She remembered the order to stop the journalist by any means necessary. She had never connected the dead journalist with the janitor hired 6 months later. After the gala, in Victoria's penthouse overlooking London from her ivory tower, the truth exploded like a bomb. James sat at the Steinway grand piano worth £200,000 playing Chopin, with a mastery that contradicted 3 years of pretense. His fingers moved on the keyboard, telling a story of pain and revenge that needed no words. Victoria had placed a gun and a hard drive on the crystal table. The choice seemed simple: eliminate the threat or surrender. But James had been playing chess while she played checkers. From his phone, he showed a protection network he had built in 3 years. Copies of evidence distributed globally, a dead man's switch system that would release everything if something happened to him. His daughter Emma protected in a secret location. The negotiation lasted until dawn. There were no screams or threats, just the cold logic of two predators who understood they were at a stalemate. James wanted justice, not revenge. Victoria wanted to survive, not necessarily win. The final agreement was recorded and transmitted live to a lawyer in Geneva. Victoria would cooperate with justice, confess everything, accept the sentence. In exchange, the Pemberton Empire would be transformed, not destroyed. The 30,000 employees would keep their jobs. The hospitals in Kenya would really be built. The Monday after the gala, London woke up to news that made the skyscrapers of Canary Wharf tremble. Victoria Pemberton had turned herself in to Scotland Yard at 6 in the morning, accompanied by 3 lawyers and 20 suitcases of documents. It wasn't a surrender. It was a programmed earthquake. The Scotland Yard building in Victoria Street became the epicenter of a judicial earthquake that would shake Britain for months. The prosecutors, used to extracting confessions with pliers, found themselves facing a CEO who poured out crimes like a flooding river. Names, dates, bank accounts, recordings. Every document was a bomb that brought down a piece of the European pharmaceutical industry. The operation was christened Clean Medicine, and within 24 hours had already produced 30 arrest warrants. Managers in handcuffs in front of cameras, mansions seized by the Serious Fraud Office, Swiss accounts frozen. Britain hadn't seen such a cleanup since the MP's expenses scandal. But the real show was taking place inside Pemberton Tower. James continued to show up every morning at 6 with his work clothes, cleaning cart, cap pulled down over his eyes. Employees looked at him with a mixture of terror and respect. Everyone now knew who he really was. The ghost colonel who had brought down the Queen. Yet he continued to clean. Every morning the bathrooms on the 5th floor, every afternoon the corridors of the 10th, every evening the main lobby. It was a ritual that kept him anchored to something real, while around him the empire crumbled and was reborn. The new board of directors, urgently appointed by terrified shareholders, summoned him every day. He entered the meeting rooms in his bleach-stained coveralls, sat between lawyers in Savile Row suits and accountants in Armani, and dispensed advice worth millions. He knew every secret of the company, every skeleton in the closet, every escape route the criminals would attempt. It was during one of these meetings that news arrived that changed everything. Robert Henderson, Victoria's right-hand man, the one who had materially organized Sarah's accident, had been arrested at Heathrow while trying to flee to Brazil. In his suitcase, documents that nailed another 50 accomplices. James received the news without batting an eye. He stood up, said he had to finish cleaning the 15th floor, and left. They found him an hour later in the men's bathroom, on his knees in front of a toilet, crying as he hadn't cried even at Sarah's funeral. They weren't tears of joy, but of liberation. 3 years of waiting were over. Emma arrived from Manchester the next day. Her grandmother could no longer take care of her. Too old, too sick. James rented a modest 2-bedroom flat in Shoreditch, 2 blocks from the tower. Nothing luxurious. A normal apartment for a normal family. In the morning he took Emma to school, then went to clean offices worth billions. In the evening he helped her with homework, dined on fish and chips, read her stories in English, French, Russian, languages he had learned in embassies around the world. The girl didn't understand why suddenly everyone wanted to be her friend at school. She didn't know that her father had become a legend. The man who had done what magistrates and journalists hadn't been able to do in 20 years. For her, Dad was still the man who made her laugh with animal impressions and who always smelled a bit of bleach. One evening, while cleaning Victoria's former office, now transformed into an archive room, James noticed something strange. A section of the oak parquet was slightly raised. Using the spatula he always kept in his tool belt, he lifted the board. Underneath, a metal box with an electronic lock. The code was obvious to anyone who knew Victoria. The date of Pemberton's IPO, her moment of maximum triumph. Inside the box, James found something he didn't expect. There was a letter, handwritten on personal letterhead. It was dated the day of the gala, probably written while he was transforming at the Savoy. Victoria had understood who he was before the Russian ambassador revealed it. She had understood the moment she saw him in a tuxedo, from the way he wore the suit, from the way he walked. In the letter, she confessed everything. But that wasn't what shocked James. It was the tone. There was no arrogance or defiance, but a strange admiration. Victoria recognized she had been beaten by a superior opponent, not in strength or wealth, but in patience and determination. She admitted that the janitor had won because he had known how to wait, observe, strike at the perfect moment. Along with the letter were keys to safe deposit boxes in Swiss banks. They didn't contain money. That had all been seized, but something more precious. Patents. Formulas for drugs that Victoria had hidden because they weren't profitable enough. Medicines for rare diseases that affected only a few thousand people in the world. Cures that weren't worth producing from an economic point of view, but that would save lives. There was also a hard drive. Inside, terabytes of research that Sarah had hacked before she died, but also original studies she had developed. James's wife hadn't just been a journalist, but a brilliant biochemist who had understood things that Pemberton's researchers had ignored for years. James spent the night reading those documents. At dawn, when Emma woke up to go to school, she found him still at his desk, surrounded by papers, with red eyes but a smile she hadn't seen in 3 years. The transformation of Pemberton accelerated. With the hidden patents and Sarah's research, the company began producing drugs that no one had ever wanted to make, medicines that cost millions in research to save hundreds of people. It was economic suicide that James transformed into moral rebirth. The employees, initially terrified of losing their jobs, discovered something incredible. The company was growing. Hospitals bought from them on principle. Governments gave subsidies. Donations came from all over the world. Pemberton was becoming what it should have always been, a company that put lives before profits. James continued to clean every evening, always the same ritual. One day a journalist managed to stop him, asked why a man who effectively controlled a billion-pound empire continued to work as a janitor. James looked at him, put down the mop, and answered with disarming simplicity. For 3 years, I pretended to be nothing to become everything. Now that I am everything, I need to remember what it means to be nothing. Because true power doesn't lie in command, but in service. Every floor I clean reminds me that the best revenge wasn't destroying Victoria, but transforming her poison into medicine. The journalist published the interview. It went viral. Within a week, the Janitor of London was trending worldwide. Offers for books, films, TV series came in avalanches. James refused them all. It wasn't his story that mattered, but Sarah's, Emma's, the 2,000 children dead in Kenya. 2 years later, from prison where she was serving her sentence, Victoria obtained day release. She showed up at the building that had once been her tower. Now transformed into the Sarah Mitchell Foundation, she had changed. Hair no longer dyed, face without makeup, simple clothes. She seemed to have found in prison what power had never given her, a conscience. She brought with her a USB with the names of all international accomplices, the last piece to complete the cleanup. When Emma met her, instead of the hatred everyone expected, she showed the unnatural wisdom of children who have suffered. She extended her hand to the woman who had ordered her mother's death, and simply said that everyone deserved a second chance. 5 years after that evening at the gala, London inaugurated the Sarah Mitchell Research Center. James cut the ribbon with Emma, now a teenager at his side. In the crowd, in the back row, Victoria watched in silence. She had served her sentence and now worked as a volunteer in an East End clinic. James's speech was brief but powerful. He spoke of how sometimes you have to pretend to be weak to defeat the strong. of how patience is the most powerful weapon, of how true revenge isn't destroying the enemy, but transforming them into something better. That evening, in the modest flat he still refused to leave, James looked at the photos on the wall. Sarah smiling, baby Emma, and strangely, a photo from the gala. Not for nostalgia, but to remember that night a janitor had accepted an invitation that had changed everything. The center today saves thousands of lives. At the entrance, a plaque bears a single sentence. Sometimes you have to pretend to clean floors to clean the world. James still keeps a mop in his office. He doesn't use it anymore, but it's there. A reminder that true power doesn't lie in what you show, but in what you hide. And that sometimes justice comes dressed as a janitor, with a mop in hand and revenge in heart. If this story kept you glued until the last word, if you felt the thrill of revelation when you understood who James really was, leave a like to support stories where nothing is as it seems. Comment with the moment that struck you most. Share with those who need to believe that justice comes, even if it has to wait 3 years hidden behind a mop. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that will keep you in suspense. Remember, true power lies in knowing how to wait for the right moment. And sometimes, the strongest are those who seem weakest. What secret does the person you see every day but never notice hide? Write it in the comments.